Hi everyone, I hope this finds you doing well. A couple of weeks ago I went to Dreamforce, and of course the main feature that they were showing all over was Agentforce, and even more specific to this target audience, Agentforce for developers. Now that's really an evolution of the technology that has previously been called Einstein GPT and then Einstein for developers, and it's something that was integrated into Illuminated Cloud in a first-class fashion pretty much when it was originally released a year ago, maybe a little bit over. In the generate menu there was an option called generate using Einstein GPT or Einstein for developers, and I've updated the IDE for the naming change to Agentforce for developers. It would open this dialog. You could pretty much enter a natural language prompt for code generation. The more detail, the more constraints, the more context you could give it, the better, and it would generate code for us. So you can see right here that it generated an implementation of Fibonacci. You could then insert that code in one of the Illuminated Cloud editors. You could provide feedback to Salesforce on the quality of the code, the quality of the response that it gave you, things like that. And this feature is still present. But there are actually several new features that were introduced as part of this, not just naming change, but new kind of generation of the offering. And I've integrated all of those into Illuminated Cloud, and I'm going to show demonstrations of each one of those integrations in this video. Now, I just do want to get just a couple of small prefaces out of the way. One, in addition to gaining a lot of knowledge at Dreamforce, I also picked up a bug. I'm on the very tail end of it. I've got a little bit of a lingering cough, so if that comes into play, I apologize in advance. And additionally, my voice may be a little bit scratchy. You may hear me clear my throat, things like that. Overall, I feel fine, but there's just that little lingering aspect of it. The second kind of caveat I want to throw out there is that, as with a lot of these AI models, the responses are not necessarily 100% consistent for the same inputs. So while this is a scripted demo, effectively, it's about as scripted as it can be. I don't know what the responses are going to be. They seem to vary. I wouldn't say wildly, but they do vary based on the exact same inputs. So there are times I may need to just kind of adapt on the fly. And the nice thing is you're seeing the integrations, you're seeing the features, just the way that they work. So hopefully that'll go smoothly. I saw some actual errors repeatedly from the server on one rehearsal earlier, and whenever I would retry the same request, everything would go fine. The third I want to mention is I've had people quite a bit in the past when I do these demos ask me what key combinations, what shortcut keys that I'm using. Well, I'm actually using and I'm going to go ahead and open the tool window for the first feature I'm going to demonstrate here. You can see at the bottom I've enabled Presentation Assistant, which actually shows you the key bindings for Windows and for Mac. Windows, Linux, and Mac. Windows and Linux tend to be the same, so you can see the same thing as I navigate around. So feel free to follow along at home watching this video and familiarize yourself with these key bindings if you'd like. So why don't we go ahead and just dive into the demo. So the first part of it is going to be in this part. It's a tool window, also available not just by key binding, but also available on the left sidebar here, called Dev Assistant. And Dev Assistant is a turn-based dialogue with the AI system where you can ask it to generate code for you. You can ask it to explain code for you so that you can better understand it, to document your code, things like that. I'm actually going to do 3 separate use cases in here, and I'll go through each in turn. For the first use case, I'm actually going to disable all context. I'll enable different aspects of context in the second and third use cases, respectively. So why don't we start by just asking this to generate some code for us. I am going to I've got my clipboard kind of filled with requests that I'm going to put in here, so you don't have to just sit there and watch me have multiple typos typing in these natural language requests. So we'll go ahead and kind of go through this. So the first thing we're going to do is ask it to just generate good old Fibonacci for us. And so I've pasted in there, and I can either hit enter or I can hit that play button that's next in the tab cycle. But I'm just going to hit enter, and we can see it's making a request. We can see this down here in the status bar that it's actually consulting with Agentforce for developers, and it'll reply. In fact, it has. And so it did, in fact, generate an iterative implementation of Fibonacci. There's no recursive nature to this. I think most people are probably familiar with the recursive implementation that's about 4 lines of code. And we're actually going to work toward that because this is a turn-based dialogue. Now you'll also see that it has some kind of a textual description accompanying the actual code. So you could actually read that. It basically describes the implementation. Why don't we go ahead and see if we can change this to a recursive implementation though. So I happen to have that right here. And so I'm going to say change to the simple recursive implementation. There are actually multiple recursive implementations. I want the one that's kind of the simple 3 or 4 lines that everybody knows. So we'll go ahead and just hit enter again, and we'll see if it comes back with the recursive implementation of this, in particular the simple one. And it did. So you can see it's basically, if it's 0 or 1, return that number or a negative number. Otherwise, return n minus 1, fib of n minus 1 plus fib of n minus 2. So that looks great. So it changed to the recursive implementation. It even said that. Now, let's see if we can get rid of the class that's around it and just have the method, because I would probably put this into my own kind of math utility class. So let's see here. Include only the method in the implementation. So let's see if it can do this for us. The nice thing is everything is cumulative, so you don't have to kind of keep restating things. It has the context of previous requests. This is truly an ongoing dialogue. And you can see it did exactly what I asked for. You can see that it stripped away the class scaffolding and left just the method. And so the only other thing that I see here is that the method name itself is not what I'd want to use. So let's go ahead and see if we can get this to change the method name to fib, something a little bit simpler. And we can see that it did that. Not only the declaration, but the usages. So it really was a rename refactoring through a text prompt effectively. And I think we have what we want. So what can we do with it? Well, I'm going to create an Apex Scratch file here real quick. And you've probably seen on all these responses that include code a couple of extra toolbar buttons, and we'll come back to the ones that are on the request. But one of the things I can do is I can copy this to the system clipboard. You can see that up here, and I can paste it in, and of course it will automatically reformat on paste, assuming that you've got the IDE set up that way. It'll automatically reformat on paste to the project formatter settings. So that's actually what we have. That looks pretty darn good. However, I wouldn't call it production worthy yet. I'd say there are 2 things that are missing. The first is documentation. We have all of this kind of textual explanation of it, but it didn't convey with the code. So everything you've seen me do so far is natural language requests. And I'm using the term requests instead of prompts because I'm entering a request into this text field, and Illuminated Cloud is taking that and aggregating that together into a prompt. Because prompt authoring, you've probably heard this said over and over with regard to AI, prompt authoring is almost like an art. I'm not saying I have that art. I actually kind of learned this from what Salesforce is doing in their reference implementation. But it is important to provide guidelines and a preface and what should and should not be included in the return and context when appropriate and all these things. And we'll see how that all gets built together. But the fact is you as the user don't need to care about that any more than the minimum required. And I'll show how you can actually add context and things like that. That whole thing is the prompt. What you're putting in here is kind of the request, which is an aspect of the prompt. So you've seen me enter natural language requests, but you can see here it says enter a natural language request or type / for commands. Well, let's type / and see what we have. Okay, so we have several things here. We're going to go through each one of these in turn and explain what each does. But right now the big thing is I want some documentation to be added. So I'm just going to hit enter here, and it's going to consult and basically ask it to add documentation. Now, it's going to add documentation to the last code in the response. And you can see it added Apex doc to it. And we'll get to this in just a moment, if you had used use the selected editor, then it would have added documentation to whatever code was in the selected editor. So that's going to basically dictate your context. If this is unchecked, it's going to be the last code, the code in the most recent response that included code in the dialog. If this is checked, the code is going to come from the selected editor. Okay, so why don't we erase what we have here, and we'll actually insert this. I can't remember if I showed this earlier, but in addition to copying to the clipboard, you can also have the Dev Assistant insert directly into your active editor. And let's take a look at the resulting Apex doc. It's pretty darn good. It's got markdown, it's well formatted, things like that. It is missing parameter text and return text, but we can fix that. I'll just do that real quick. The value for which told you you're going to see me typo number should be returned, and it returns the Fibonacci number for the provided value. And now we look at our Apex doc, and it's pretty complete. So that's great. So we have documentation. The second thing that's needed excuse me, in order to make this kind of production worthy, production ready, is a test. We need to be able to verify the behavior of this in case we make changes so that we've got a regression harness, things like that. You may or may not have noticed that there was another slash command called test. Now it takes a parameter, as you can see there. So I'm going to show, if you don't enter a parameter, it's going to warn you, but I'm going to go ahead and say I want it to generate for fib. Now, the same thing applies here. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Same thing applies here, that if I'm not using the selected editor, it's going to use the code from the last response that had code. Otherwise, it'll use the selected editor, and you have to name a method that's actually in the class in that editor. So it has returned, and it actually generated a big unit test for Fibonacci. And so you can see it's got low values, medium values, a little bit higher values, negative values, kind of boundary cases, things like that, edge cases. I've even seen it generate one that at the end had a couple commented out that were like fib of 100, fib of 1,000, but that were commented out saying, because you've got a recursive implementation, these put you in danger of a Stack Overflow error. Because of course the iterative implementation, while not as concise, is much better for getting larger values because it's not dependent upon stack depth. Okay. So, I think that we've actually shown here that we can go from asking for it to generate code based on something well-established, design patterns, well-known algorithms, things like that with no context, iterating on that until we get it exactly the way that we want it, adding documentation to it, and adding a unit test for it. We did that in like 5 requests, building upon themselves, and effectively have this code now. To me, that's pretty remarkable, and it all looks pretty good. Now, to be clear, that's not going to be the case with every example I'm going to be showing. This one is one of the cleaner ones that you're going to find. There are times when it's going to, make incorrect guesses, things like that. But having said that, I think what I've just shown here, I'm not saying that about, this is about Salesforce. Salesforce has done a wonderful job enhancing their AI large language model and contextual model for their platform over the last year or so since they first introduced this. And by the way, this is not just available for Apex. For example, here is a here's a JavaScript example in a Lightning Web Component, and it can also act upon that, or it can act upon HTML, things like that. I'll actually show some concrete examples, but I just wanted to be clear that while I've shown Apex so far, it's not just about Apex. Okay, so that was really the first use case. That is a no additional context provided, generate code, refine, things like that use case. Let's move on to the second use case. And in that case, I want to, because everything is cumulative, I actually want to clear this dialog and start fresh. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One is I can just click this button right here. Another one is that I can, if I had scrolled to the top, now we can talk about this button, the trash can button on the request, is I could remove this request and it says, hey, this is the first request. If I remove this, everything after it no longer makes sense. So this will just clear the dialog. If you, by the way, did that for an intermediate request, like for example, change to the simple recursive implementation, notice that it says this doesn't necessarily invalidate everything after it, but it changes it, right? You kind of have to rebase it because, you asked me to extract a method, it would be the iterative method, not the recursive method. You asked me to generate documentation, you asked me to generate a test, those change. So this says if you delete kind of an intermediate request, it has to re-execute the ones that come after that to effectively rebase the dialog. Now we're not going to do that right now, but that's, it'll automatically do that for you. And if you want to remove, say, the last one, then there's nothing else that needs to be re-executed. You basically just moved up a step. And you can even do that from a slash command. You can say slash undo, and it'll remove the most recent exchange, basically request and response, and take you back to the previous step in your dialog. But we want to clear it. We want to start a whole new dialog and a whole new use case. So the third way I can do this is to type /clear, and then I can hit enter, and that kind of resets me. I like the slash commands. They're quick. I don't necessarily have to reach for the mouse. I don't have to use an accelerator key, things like that. Okay, so what is the second use case? Well, I want to generate a SOQL query for a custom object, actually 2 custom objects that I have here locally. I have the shopping list object, and then I have a child object that has a master detail relationship with it called shopping list item. And I want you to look really carefully that there's no intermediate in the base name. There's no intermediate underscores or anything like that. So let's ask it to generate a SOQL query for all shopping lists and their shopping list items. And I'm going to hit enter. And so it sends off the request, and let's see what it comes back with. So it came back with a query, and at a first glance it looks okay, maybe, but no, that's not my object. that has an underscore between shopping and list. And similar over here, and I'll expand a little bit, the relationship, mine is called items, not items, not shopping underscore list underscore items. So my guess is that when they trained the current model behind this, that some of the code that they used to train it actually had this particular object in it, this custom object in it, or these custom objects, and it was included in the training, and so it was able to make a guess based on what I wanted. But that's not the object that I wanted. It's not the query that I wanted. So how can it give a better response? Well, we're going to start with just this option right here, include reference custom schema, and I'm going to show another / command, retry, that's going to basically remove the previous request and re-execute it exactly as is with any context option changes you've made, with any change to your context files, whatever it happens to be, because that can obviously change the response. And let's see, we can already see that it's changed the request because it added referenced S objects to the request. So how did it know about shopping list and shopping list item? Because these are my objects. So how did it know about those just from this textual query? And by the way, the query in the response is correct. That is my shopping list. It does have an items underscore R relationship. It has this store field. Everything looks right. So how did it know that? Well, one thing that I've done is I've made it so that if you have this option checked, it will Illuminated Cloud will scan your request and it will look for certain substrings and will use those to determine whether you're trying to reference certain custom objects, not standard, not standard fields. Those are already in the trained model on the Salesforce side. They have access to that. This is about identifying custom objects and custom fields from your local project in a way that the schema for those can be sent over as context along with the request. That's the prompt building, part of the prompt building I was talking about. So you could either type in the API name, shopping list and shopping list item with the underscore C, things like that, or you can type in what is effectively the end user facing name, which comes from the label metadata. So shopping list item. And that's exactly what I've done here. And that automatically prompted, no pun intended, Illuminated Cloud to add the schema for these two custom objects to the request, the overall prompt that's being sent over, and it resulted in the correct query versus the incorrect query. Similarly, I could use the API name. I have another one that's an expense. Generate a SOQL query for expense underscore C rows. And you can see it correctly found and included the expense underscore C custom object. And like I said, you don't need that for standard objects. So if I say generate a SOQL query for accounts and their contacts, it didn't need to go and get schema for that, but we're going to get a valid query out of this because, again, the model is already trained on that. It just needs additional contextual information about things that you only have locally. Now, admittedly, they're in the server, but they need to be included in the request context. And so you can see that, yes, there's an accounts relation or a context relationship on account. There's an email field on the contact object, standard object. So no need to provide additional context there. So that's one way to provide context. What's another way? Well, let's uncheck this just so that we know that that's not being used, and check use the selected editor. We're going to go ahead and reset our dialog. We're going to move into the third use case for the Dev Assistant feature, and I'm going to go over here to this old creaky Visualforce controller that, let's ignore the fact that it's old and it's creaky, and let's more focus on the fact that it helps to tell a story here. So for a moment, let's pretend we don't know a thing about this. We're looking at this for the first time. Some of you may be, and I'm going to use another /command /explain, and I'm basically going to ask the Dev Assistant to, in plain text words, explain to me the behavior and the qualities of this particular class. And you can see that it sent over additional context. So first, it sent over the file itself. So it has the content of the file so it can explain it. But then it also sent over these referenced S objects. I didn't say anything about those in the request. So the way it found them is they are actually referenced directly from this file. And so any custom S objects, any custom S object fields will result in custom S object schema being sent over. So even if you had a custom field on a standard object, if that was referenced in here, the custom schema aspect of that standard object would be sent over automatically as context. And so you can see in the response, it correctly surmises that this is a visual force page controller, that what these methods are, constructors, things like that. It actually comments on the overall organization and structure of the class. It says well structured and organized. But let's see if we can get some additional information on it. Provide suggestions for improvement for the class. I've gotten widely variable responses on this, so we're just going to kind of wing it here as we go through based on how it replies. And then I'll tell you some of the other responses I've gotten. Okay, this is wonderful. It actually gave quite specific recommendations here. So it actually said for specific methods in the class, consider adding input validation to those. Look at a more efficient way to handle removal because there's a loop there. Add error handling. So this is actually pretty darn good. Add additional documentation. I'm not sure where it would want that. So it says it's okay, but here's some options for improvement. So we're going to try something here, and I have no idea what we're going to get back. And I'm going to say, please apply your suggestions for improvement and show the resulting class. Okay, so I will say ahead of time as it's doing this, I've seen this return the exact same class. I've seen it return a truncated version of the same class. I've seen it return a class with some actual changes in it. Let's see what it does this time. Obviously, it's taking a little bit longer on the server, so that may be a good sign that we're going to get back something. Okay, so we got back a full class. Okay, so I'm actually going to take this and I'm going to paste it in here, and we'll see if it actually made any changes. So I'm going to scroll up to the top of this, and I'm going to insert this. And I'm going to open this in local changes. And let's see if it made any changes. It did make one change. It made a change to save. And it looks like it removed my commented stuff, so that was actually lost. That's fine. So we did actually add some error handling to save. So again, your mileage may vary. I think it would probably go better if you asked for specific changes to be applied one at a time, rather than saying go take everything that you said previously. I haven't tried that, but I think that may yield better results. But you get the idea. You can have it look at your existing code, tell you about it, offer suggestions for it, potentially even implement some of those suggestions for you. Extremely powerful. Not always what you expect or what you want, but certainly worth looking into as options for improvement to your improvement for and the implementation, and also your understanding of existing code. Often code that you've not seen before, or maybe it's your own, you haven't seen it in a while. Okay, so excuse me. I did mention that some of the stuff is available for Lightning Web Components as well. Let's show an example of that. I'm going to go ahead and clear this. I'm going to keep the Use the Selected Editor. We're going to go over here to this JavaScript, and let's see if it'll explain this JavaScript for us. So you can see that the context file is now the actual kind of controller JavaScript side of this particular Lightning Web Component, and it correctly surmised that this is a JavaScript file. It's part of a Lightning Web Component, and it talks about its properties and its methods, and it figures out that it is using certain platform-specific imports. It's discerned up here that it's using the barcode scanner API from Salesforce Lightning Mobile, things like that. So you actually get quite a bit of decent information. And how about the HTML? Now I'm going to clear this because remember, everything's cumulative, and I don't want it to kind of confuse me asking for an explanation of the whole component, because now it knows about JavaScript and the HTML. So we'll go ahead and say explain. And we'll see what it says about the HTML side of this. So again, it correctly says it is HTML in the LWC syntax, and it talks about some of the actual components or subcomponents that are in it, or tags rather, and it talks about some of the behavior that's in it. So not a bad way to get a look at stuff. You can technically use this against Aura JavaScript and Aura, well, really just Aura JavaScript. But what I found is, I'm not restricting that, but what I found is it doesn't have very deep insights into Aura. It looks like the model was primarily trained on Apex and Lightning Web Components. Okie dokie. All right, I think that's what I wanted to show for the first of the key features, which is the Dev Assistant. Let's move on to the second. And the second has to do with unit test generation. We've already shown one example of that, where we generated a unit test for fib. for one specific method. Is there is there a facility for doing that on a broader basis? And the answer, of course, is yes. A couple of months ago, I added a new code generation feature for Apex to Illuminated Cloud, which is generate test, that allows you to generate a test class for a product class and stub test methods, including a test setup method optionally for the product methods, the kind of public interface methods. And this is the dialog that's shown with a few changes. These options weren't there. The first one I'll point out, though, is in the previous implementation before this, the test class, the target test class in which you want the test methods to be inserted, had to be a new test class. You could not choose an existing test class. Well, that's changed. You can now choose an existing test class, and even if you're not doing AI-based unit test generation, that's really useful if you've added a new method to your, say, utility class, and you want to add a new test method for it to your utility test class, companion test class, is you can just do that in place and you can add it. So you can do it whether you're generating or not. You can even see that this is an existing one, so it won't let me change the target directory. But if I type, a random extension on the end, now I can choose the target directory. I want to go in the test classes directory. Let's go ahead and generate a test setup method. And we do want to generate implementations for these tests using Agentforce for developers. I'll come back and talk about this next option in just a moment. It'll make more sense. So we'll go ahead and generate for the first two only, just as a first iteration. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And we can see it generated the new class. It's asking me to add it to version control. And we can see it's now communicating with Agentforce for developers for each of the product methods for which we want unit test methods in turn. And so let's see what we ended up with. Now, I'm going to just go ahead and say in advance, this is a place where I've seen some, basically the generated code is rarely final. It can be syntactically invalid, meaning not conformant to the Apex grammar, in which case Illuminated Cloud will insert it, but insert it commented out with a warning. It can be syntactically valid, but semantically invalid, like these are, where it conforms to Apex, but it includes references and things like that that aren't valid. And it can even not generate at all, but give an error as to why it couldn't. And again, Illuminated Cloud will include that information, say something like, I couldn't, basically Agentforce for developers could not generate a test method for this product method, and here's the reason why, and include whatever text was sent back. But let's take a look at what it did do. So first, it generated a stub setup method. That's not part of the AI. That's just part of the facility that was already there. It generated a test method for get shopping list, a variation for when you have a non-empty shopping list. It seems to think that there is a controller, a no-arg controller, a no-arg constructor for this controller. There's not one. You would have to actually build this up from standard controller and such. And it seems to think that this property of the controller is visible, and it's not. It's a private, non-test visible property, and so it's trying to assign to it. So there would be some restructuring needed here, but the general flow, the general logic of a test like this is here. And it would probably not take very long to get it into shape. The big question, of course, is would it take less time than it would be to write this test from scratch? And I think the answer is going to be yes sometimes and no sometimes, but it's always worth seeing what it generates. And then test delete shopping lists. We've got the exact same types of issues that we talked about previously with the constructor. There's no-arg constructor, and this is not an accessible property. So not quite right, but probably not far from right. Wouldn't take much tinkering to get right. We're not going to fix that right now. Instead, we're going to do another iteration of test generation. We're going to do it into the same class, and I'm going to choose all test methods this time, which means that it is going to be generating additional testing logic for get shopping list and delete shopping list, and that is where this option comes into play. So effectively, when you generate tests for a method that already has test coverage in the same target class, Illuminated Cloud searches for those existing tests and includes them in the overall prompt as context, and that helps the server not generate the same test, generate novel, unique, distinct test patterns. Maybe it generates negative tests where it generated positive tests before, whatever it happens to be. And there's a couple of ways it can search for those. When this is unchecked, it will search in this class for test methods that immediately, directly call these methods, these product methods. However, if you're one of those that creates utility methods in your test classes or test utility classes that encapsulate calling of your actual product code, and then your tests actually call that utility method or class, then you would need to check this, because this is going to do a transitive search for it. Again, it's only going to identify ones in the same class, but it really will determine what will determine whether you want this checked or not is whether it can find direct references or indirect references. I'm going to leave this the way that it is, but hopefully that explains that option. So here we go again. Test shopping list, delete shopping list. It's basically going to go through each one of these in turn. It's going to add them to the class, and then we'll take a look exactly what we have. And we should see, 2 or more methods for get shopping list, 2 or more methods for delete shopping list, and generally 1 method for the other ones that are net new. So you also may have noticed, I didn't show this at the time, is it didn't even give us the option to generate test setup because it recognized there was already a test setup annotated method in here. So get shopping list empty and delete shopping list ID empty were from before. Add item with existing header. Now here is another example of something that is semantically incorrect, and in fact this is what is often called a hallucination. If you think about what a hallucination is, and maybe I said this earlier, I apologize, it basically means that you're seeing something that's not there, and in fact that's what's going on. It's seeing the presence of, in this case, the Apex mocks library in my project when that doesn't actually exist. Obviously some of the code that the model was trained on did have access to that, and so it's just kind of taking a guess that my project would have access to that. So this one is probably completely invalid unless I had Apex mocks or another mocking library and I wanted to adapt to that. Probably would still require some changes. Test remove item. Test save for update. Here's another get shopping list test, and it will be materially different from the other one, and another delete shopping list test. Here's another one where it made an incorrect assumption. Evidently in some of the code that it was trained on, there is an authorization util class that has this method. Now my project actually has an authorization util class, but that's not part of its interface. So it made some guesses. They're not quite right. I've seen it also say, hey, there must be a create test user method available in all tests. So again, the overall question is going to be, is this a productivity gain? Is it faster to take what was generated and make the minor changes? Hopefully minor changes are required in order to get it into ship shape, or is it faster to write it from scratch? And again, I think it's going to vary based on the use case, and it's going to vary based on the person. I think it's worth trying and see how it does for things as you're writing new code or adding new test code. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show for test generation using AI. Let's go ahead and move on to the next use case, and that's going to be inline completion. So we'll go ahead and move back over here to Shopping List Mobile View Controller, and I'm going to open the settings, and I'm going to go to completion, and in particular to code completion. And you can even see it's editor, general, code completion. And if I scroll down, there is now a section for Agentforce for developers. The default configuration of this is going to be as shown here. It's going to be the feature itself is enabled. Auto completion, meaning after you finish typing for some period of time, short period of time, 500 milliseconds, you can go down to 500 milliseconds, that's the lowest, up to 5 seconds, but some period of time after you finish typing. After that, it'll issue a request to the server, and we'll see if it has any suggestions for auto completions or for inline completions where you are, and we'll display those to you. I'll explain more about why I have this disabled by default as we go through it. I think it'll become more obvious. Specifically my opinion on it. I'm going to leave the auto completion delay at the lowest, and we'll go ahead and kind of go through a demo here. So let's just start modifying. I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to basically just leave it there for a second, and if things go well, we should see something inserted, and we did. And so it is taking a guess on what code you'd want here, and sometimes it'll have multiple options. Now the key bindings for this, by the way, are documented in the release notes, and they're documented in JetBrains' own documentation that's linked from the release notes for inline completion. But the key bindings are not advertised very well here, and I've spoken to JetBrains about that. They know about that. This is in support of their own inline completion capabilities, and they're looking to make it kind of onboarding of this feature easier, because the most that you get is understanding that tab is your completion. This shows that this inline completion came from Agentforce for developers, and it gives you the option, the queue that you can use tab to complete it or change the completion key. Excuse me again. So let's just show. If I hit tab, it'll insert this. So it actually did insert it. The error below is because that's a final variable, and Illuminated Cloud is saying now we could potentially have set the value twice in the same flow. So let's get rid of that, and I'm going to hit enter again. and we'll see it gets inserted. I'm going to show you some other things that you can do with it. So I can hit escape if I want to reject it. I'm not sure we're getting a completion back this time, so I'm going to force it. Sometimes just doing it over and over in the same spot gives you different responses. I'm going to force it with the keystroke. You can see it at the bottom. It's saying that there's nothing. Well, obviously we saw that it had some ideas there, and then I did it again and it showed it. That's neat, and that's what I meant by there's some variability. And again, we have options. But in that option, notice is incomplete. There is an unclosed query there. You see the square bracket, open square bracket, but there's no closed square bracket. So you do have to be careful of that. I've noticed that in some of the code that it generates. Okay, so you can accept it a word at a time using next word. You can accept it a line at a time using end of line. So those are some of the ways that you can actually accept the code in addition to tab. And then additionally, and we'll see if it'll insert on its own through auto completion here. Looks like it's not going to, so we'll force it. There we go. You can also hit escape if you just don't want it. So that'll actually back you out of it. And sometimes, and let's see if we can do this, I'm just going to say, so it automatically inserted that one. I'm going to go ahead and say log the shopping list state, and I'm going to hit enter, and hopefully it'll take that as a cue to put some debug logging in here. It may not. Not quite what I was looking for. All right. Now, still, this is wrong. Logger is not the standard logger. Obviously, it's somebody's logger that the model was trained on. It's not ours. Should have been system.debug. But you can see that you can create a comment and kind of talk about what your intention is, and it will take that into account, or it may take that into account for the code that gets generated. Okay, so you get the idea, though, and we can show also that this works, again, in Lightning Web Components. I can go over here and I'm just going to hit enter, and we'll see. Hopefully it'll suggest some HTML, kind of LWC HTML to put in here. And there you go. So it thinks we have an error message component. We don't. Obviously someone does again. And so it's recommending that. And as another option, it's recommending some incomplete HTML here, some incomplete component code, because obviously that component's not even finished. And so, but we can see that the same feature is available in HTML. And we can also do the same thing here. Let's see. What's a good example here? Let's right here. This dot dispatch event new show toast event, and let's just see if it can insert some parameters for us. So we can see that it actually gave us a couple of different options there. So it's available in Apex, it's available in Lightning Web Components, and in CSS as well. If you may play with that and see how that goes in terms of suggesting new styles, new selectors, things like that. Okay, so let's go back for a second to what I said about why is auto completion disabled by default. Again, this is a personal preference. If your preference is otherwise, you can turn it on. My feeling is that when it provides suggestions, I think more often than not, I'm just going to hit escape. Excuse me, and I'm going to reject that suggestion. And when I want one, it's very easy for me to just go ahead and hit the explicit request, and if it has nothing there, that's fine. Let's do this dot dispatch event new show toast event again. And so it's not going to autocomplete. I turn that off, but I can force it here. And so that's a point where I want to say, you know what, I bet it knows what I want here. And I just use the keystroke to get it. And that way I'm not always hitting escape when I'm trying to type. Again, I think everyone's different. You may want it enabled. You may want to just crank up the delay from half a second to a second and a half or something like that, so that it's not happening as often. But if you just kind of want to see what it has to say, you just kind of sit there for a second and a half. But that's why it's disabled by default. Okay, so that's basically the demonstration I wanted to show. We showed Dev Assistant, we showed unit test logic generation, and we showed inline completion, both auto completion and explicit when you hit a particular keystroke. As you can see, there's some variability in the responses in terms of validity, in terms of accuracy of what you were asking for, in terms of quality, things like that. I will say that no matter what, this is remarkable. What the team here has done, especially relative to where things were last year, is absolutely fantastic. And you can only imagine that over the next few months, this is only going to improve. There's going to be a feedback cycle that happens as people send their, accept or reject information off to Salesforce. There's going to be a lot of new code being entered into this. New generations of the models are going to be created that are more accurate or more refined. So it's only going to get better from here, and it's a heck of a starting point. But I will say, obviously, you need to obviously be judicious in your use of it, and make sure that what you're using is what you're wanting. I think the unit test comes specifically to mind. The code generation and the textual descriptions, explanations of code, and the addition of documentation, that all looks pretty darn good. Always review what it gives you, though. If you see poor suggestions in Illuminated Cloud, poor responses coming in Illuminated Cloud, and you, for example, want to go look at the reference implementation of this in Salesforce VS Code, and if you see for the exact same inputs, the exact same context, better recommendations, let me know. Like I said, prompt building is a big part of this, and I've structured the prompts for each one of these based on what I've observed in the reference implementation, and most of them are very close to what's in it. Some of them are identical. Some of them there's a slight variation based on some things that I saw, but the fact is that Salesforce may be changing. They have access to the backend. They may be changing the way that certain additional context information is processed, things like that. So again, if you're seeing a quality difference between what Illuminated Cloud gives for the same inputs versus what VS Code does, that's all about the prompt. It's not about the actual local implementation other than the information that goes into the prompt. And so that's very easy to go and identify and modify. Just give me a concrete reproducible example and I'll go take a look and get it caught up. But and if you see any bugs, let me know about them. If you see any opportunities for improved usability, let me know about them. Let me know what you think of it in general. I'm always curious to hear, but otherwise have fun with it. I mean, we have AI integrated into our IDEs now in many different ways, and it gives us a lot of different opportunities for playing with the technology. So having said all that, thank you very much for your time, and I will talk to you later.